Today we're talking about an item that had quite a few changes already considering its very recent release, and that item is Arondight. We're going to look at how Arondight changed over time, and then we're also going to look at how the item performs nowadays compared to your typical early game damage items. And last but not least, we'll also look at which guards can make good use of it and which guards you should potentially avoid it on because it doesn't work well on them. Before we get started, I wanted to say thanks for the feedback on yesterday's video. Now, it is obviously not the format that's gonna pull in the most viewers or something, I said that yesterday already, but honestly, a surprising number of you watched and enjoyed the video and left very positive feedback about it. So thank you for that, and I will continue to try and fit in those type of formats in the future and also take some lessons from that, so you'll see some of that in today's video as well, in terms of the visual layout and everything. And now let's look at Arondight's stages over time. When Arondight was released, Hi-Rez had the following description for that. Arondight is the Sword of Lancelot. Assassins and warriors often engage with their ultimates and seek to continue the pressure by attacking the backline. Arondight enables this playstyle, not only revealing enemies in a large area, but granting bonus speed and damage for successfully chasing down targets. So that made a lot of sense, but at the same time Arondight was far from what other items were that were released along with it, because the original stats were relatively low. It was an item for warriors and assassins only, with a cost of 2,600 gold, 10% cooldown reduction, 55 physical power, and the passive that it still has nowadays, that when you cast your ultimate ability, you will reveal enemies within 120 feet of you for 8 seconds, you get a 30% movement speed increase when running towards them, and you deal an additional 40 base damage plus 30% of your physical power as scaling when hitting an enemy after that. This only counts for the first hit after hitting a revealed target, and it works for every target that is revealed at the time, so you can basically put that on the whole team if you get them all together. The item has an internal cooldown of 45 seconds, meaning that most of the time you will be able to use it with every single ultimate. The passive was nice, but the stats were just not justifiable for the price initially, especially with items like Jotun's Wrath existing that overall just had better base stats for their price. However, Hi-Rez recognized this, and a few patches later, they stated that Arondight was clearly the weakest of the new items. It had the lowest purchase rate, and player feedback was unanimous in that these stats did not match the cost. Therefore, the power was increased from 55 to 65. After that, the item picked up in play a little bit. It was played more as a niche item mostly, but it was already picked up around Worlds as well, around the SPL, which was played on a patch where it didn't receive its next buff yet, and it was picked up on 4 different guards, which we'll talk about a bit later. But still, it was a niche item, and with the newest patch, which had the Freya rework as well, we now see another change to this item. With the release of the Arthurian items, we saw a large increase in community theory crafting, exploring the best use cases for these items. While Pridwin and Failnot have found a solid home in the right situations, Arondight and Staff of Myrddin have struggled to find the same point of balance. We feel their effects are potent, but need some help in their base power to be more competitive. And that is exactly what happened with Arondight by increasing the power from 65 to 75. As a result, we now have an item with 75 power for 2,600 gold. To get the same power out of another item, you could buy Bloodforge for 2,800 gold, but then you wouldn't get the cooldown reduction and lifesteal instead, which is typically not as useful for assassins. The other option is Transcendence, which we'll actually look at in comparison here. So I made a list of 3 items plus Arondight to look at here so we can compare them directly. And my goal here was to specifically look towards early game item choices. In late game you become a lot more flexible in what you choose, and you could consider options like Heartseeker as well, but that is a lot more expensive. And I wanted to see what happens if we build this in 3rd slot. That's the slot where you'd normally see a damage item like Jotun's Wrath or like Crusher or Hydra's Lament, or quite often recently Transcendence. So the items that I picked out here to compare were Jotun's Wrath, Transcendence, and Hydra's Lament. Those are the items that come with power and with cooldown reduction, so those are the items that are really comparable to Arondight and are useful in this particular scenario. We can see that price-wise they're around a similar range, with Jotun's Wrath being a little bit cheaper, 250 gold, and Hydra's Lament being 2,150 gold, so a fair bit cheaper than the others. I also put in 2 versions of Transcendence here, one without stacks and one with full stacks. Of course, the price doesn't change, but the power will change, just to see how much of an impact these stacks really have on the overall damage output of the item and also on the competitiveness against Arondight. In terms of power, we can see here that Jotun's Wrath and Hydra's Lament are significantly lower, while Transcendence, even unstacked, comes at 63 power, and Arondight with the 75, somewhere between the no stacks and the full stacks of 85 power. In terms of penetration, we only have that on Jotun's Wrath, and it's a flat 10. The cooldown reduction of all of these items is 10, with the exception of Jotun's Wrath, which has 20% cooldown reduction. On the other hand, when using the ultimate, Arondight comes with 30% extra movement speed, plus 40 flat damage, and plus 0.3 or 30% scaling damage. Hydra's Lament, on the other hand, comes with 50% extra scaling after using an ability for the next basic attack. There are some other bonus stats that don't really concern us here. That's the reveal for 8 seconds with Arondight, the mana for Jotun's Wrath, and the mana to power conversion with Transcendence, which is already factored in for the power here, as well as some MP5 on Hydra's Lament. But those are not really the primary stats, but rather bonus effects, useful effects. And I would argue that out of those, Arondight probably wins because that reveal is extremely powerful as well. But that's not what I would look at first as an assassin if I'm looking for a damage item. And this is where things get really interesting, and I'll use a bit of a different way of showing that from what I used to do usually, so I can highlight things better as well, and that should make it a little bit more clear, a little bit more understandable. So what you can see here is that we are adding Assassin's Blessing and Warrior Tabai to the build, along with any of the other items, because we're going to look at more early game focused stats here, and that's something that I think you can reasonably have around level 10, which we're going to deal with. So that are our items here, and Assassin's Blessing in this case is fully stacked, so you have the extra pen from that. That brings us to these total power values that you can see here. A little bit more for Arondight and Transcendence, especially when stacked, of course, whereas Jotun's Wrath and Hydra's Lament are at 80 each, the others being 110-ish plus 115, 125 at max. And the penetration, on the other hand, is 5 for all items, with the exception here of Jotun's Wrath, because it has that extra 10 flat pen, and the other ones just rely on Assassin's Blessing alone. So, with our stats here, we're looking at the following combo on a level 10 Thor, using the ultimate plus the 1 and the 3 and 2 extra basic attacks. The order here that is a bit different from what I said, because the ultimate has to be used first for all the effects to apply properly, as we want to have the effect of Arondight, of course. We're going to look at a combination without the ultimate afterwards to compare that as well. And we're going to include 4 of Thor's extra procs from his ultimate effect that he gets for damaging enemies during his ult. So we have to factor all that into the flat damage values here. So we have all the base damage values of the abilities with the corresponding rank here. We have to make sure that we have the right stats for level 10 and not for level 20. As well as the extra arc damage, as well as some extra damage for Arondight specifically here, because it has that extra base damage effect that the other ones don't have, as well as the base damage from the basic attacks. And that makes it so that the only net value that's different here on flat damage is Arondight with 851, the rest is all 811. When it comes to the scaling, we can see that Arondight is again a little bit higher, because here it also includes that extra scaling effect from the attacks that you get through the passive, and also the extra scaling on Hydra's Lament, which is actually 50% per hit. So with 2 basic attacks, that's an extra 100% scaling over the others here. Quite interesting how much of an impact on the scaling that has. And that leads us to the total damage values here, but they don't really tell us that much yet, because these total damage values don't include the penetration or the protections that we're working against yet, so they're not really that important in my opinion. What we want to look at is what the whole thing does against 50 protections, because then we can factor in Jotun's Wrath as well. I used 50 protections here first because that's what you'll have around that level roughly. You can have a little bit less, like 40 something-ish, but it's ballpark area basically, and it's good enough for all calculations that we can make here. And what we can see here with Arondight, with the ultimate and the passive effect, is that we get 1079 damage, and that's the highest value that we get. Jotun's Wrath has 950 damage, so roughly 100 less, and Transcendence unstacked also 978, roughly 100 less, while fully stacked Transcendence reaches almost the same damage as Arondight, only 11 damage less, so really not significant at that point. And Hydro's Lament is okay-ish, I would say, with 940 damage, considering it's quite a fair bit cheaper, but still that's a far cry from where Arondight sits in terms of damage output. So for this particular combo with the ultimate, it definitely looks pretty good. Versus 100 protections, which is what you would have if you have an enemy that has a single physical defense item at this point, roughly, again, could be a little bit more, a little bit less. We will have different numbers. Here we can see that Arondight comes out once again on top with 802 damage. But we can see that the damage gap here between Jolton's Wrath and Arondight is still roughly 100. Transcendence, however, starts actually a little bit higher already, I think, in comparison. So it starts with 728 and then goes up to 794, whereas Hydro's Lament stays at 699. It's not really a massive difference to Transcendence, but it is interesting that it even against a fully stacked Transcendence comes out on top, when you have to keep in mind that usually you're not going to have the fully stacked Transcendence at that point, especially if you're playing in the jungle. It's going to take a little bit to get the full stacks, and until that point, Arondight will have more impact, which will especially be important if we go more towards a early game-ish meta at any point in the near future. And typically it used to be the case that the pen items are just the best option for those early game metas because they just hit harder in the early game and they're easier to come by and cheaper. But with Arondight we have something that is not reliant on pen but still gives you a truckload of damage, and that's very fascinating in my opinion. But we also have to look at a combo without the ultimate because we don't always have the ultimate, and Arondight's full strength revolves a lot around the ultimate. For that we're gonna use Thor again, level 10, but this time we're only using the 1 and the 3 and 1 basic attack. Just, you know, quickly chasing after an enemy, then maybe hitting him with a basic, like double tapping him with a 1, hitting him with a basic after teleporting and then using the 3 to spin. And we see here is the flat damage is now the same for all of the items because Arondight no longer gives us extra flat damage. The scaling is the same for every item except Hydro's Lament, because Hydro's Lament gets the extra scaling from 1 basic attack here. And the total damage output resulting out of that is, again, not very important. We can kind of see a pattern here already, but we want to see what happens when we add in protections. At this point, in this case, with 50 protections, we have 605 damage with Arondight, which is still pretty good actually. Jolton's Wrath, we have 564. With Transcendence, we have 578. But when it's fully stacked, we have 628. So Transcendence comes out on top here by a little bit. Hydro's Lament comes in at 553 damage. So again, very close to Jolton's Wrath, which is interesting. As long as you can get the basic attacks off, Hydro's Lament really does very well. And the more basics and combos you can throw in, the better it becomes really. But that depends entirely on the god you're playing and your play style. And your aim as well, basically. So it's a bit more luck-based as well. And then at 100 protections, we can see that Arondight deals 450 damage, Jolton's Wrath deals 412 damage, and Transcendence deals 430 unstacked and 467 fully stacked. Hydro's Lament comes in at 411, basically the same as Jolton's Wrath. So what we can see here, what we can say here is that Arondight is definitely still a strong item even when the passive is not involved. It is still stronger than an unstacked Transcendence, and it's still pretty close to a stacked Transcendence, which again will take you a lot longer to get to. So I would say as long as you are not planning to go into further items that enhance Transcendence, such as Heartseeker or other items with extra mana, and as long as you are looking to maximize your early game, and as long as your Assassin or your god in general makes good use of Arondight, Arondight is probably the favorable option, at least in any meta that's not completely late game focused. And here you have to keep in mind the difference between more casual play and pro play, where in casual play you often have games that are over relatively quickly, whereas in pro play the super late game builds are what's most favored at the moment and it's really important for them. So overall, I would say a definite win for Arondight, and I would say that the stats might actually be a bit too good for the price at this point, depending on which assassin we're talking about, because the effect can be utilized to different degrees by different assassins. And I was originally planning to talk about that today, but this video ended up being way longer than expected, especially after I finished recording all the other parts for that as well. So I'm going to split that into two here. and I will discuss the other half with the different guards and how well it works on them and how they utilize it tomorrow. And if you want to see that, then feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell so that you get notified of that. And for today, I thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you for the next part tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.